does a lot of discussion of the cello.
Yeah.
And, and I've studied the cello and still study the cello. And I remember I think, how do I put this? At the outset, I recognized that there was a vast world of things that I had to learn. And when you look at something that way, you might, or I tended to look at it in terms of its scale. Like, I have all this to learn. The fact of the matter is that I never imagined that something like thumb position on the neck of the cello would be such a big deal. Where I put my thumb in relation to my other fingers would be such a big deal. I never, ever imagined that there would be books on thumb position. And I also never imagined that some of the things that I thought I should do in order to help myself learn to construct notes more efficiently were actually, in the long term, hindering me from understanding the cello in a more sensitive way. So what I mean specifically is, I put little pieces of tape on the neck of the cello so that I could know where my finger positions were. And as I went along, not only did I not look at those tapes more and more, but I also discovered that in many cases, they weren't helpful.
Yeah.
In other words, they didn't help me to construct precisely the sound that I was searching for. And that, in fact, when I took them off, finally, and started looking for the sound, searching for the sound, creating sounds that were not precisely what I was after. So they represented problems, and then I would go to find another problem.
Right.
I would be seeking out these problems.
And here we are back at problem finding. Yeah.
And here we are back at problem finding. And it was enormously helpful to not employ tools that would simplify this process.
Well, so there's the question. Sorry, go finish your sentence.
Well, and just to say that it not only was it not helpful, but it was profoundly imprecise as I went along. Yeah. Even though I positioned those tapes with an electronic tuner and all that sort of thing. So,
right. And the laser.
Exactly the way I thought it should be.
Right.
And working with data the way I thought I should. But that is not a dynamic situation. And when you're playing and you have all these dynamics at work, then the sounds you're looking for might be somewhat different than what you could create individually and statically.
Yeah. No, I am going to ask my first question. Do you regret putting those pieces of tape on your cello?
No, I don't. Only because it gave me a concrete understanding of why I shouldn't have.
That is not the answer that I expected. That's a really cool answer. There is no wasted work, right?
Our mistakes can be powerfully informative.
Yeah, right. I've had terrible days writing where I did damage to my manuscript to the extent where I had to close the file without saving so that I would go back to the previous day, because I not only had failed to make any progress, I'd actually destroyed something.
Right.
But that failure gave me the motivation to make changes to the way I live around writing. Things that I had been too well, I hadn't been too lazy to do it, but I didn't know that it was that important. I didn't know that I should prioritize. Uh, in this case, it was reviewing my writing notes from the day before. And I was like, who needs to do that? I remember what I'm supposed to be doing, but then
Yeah.
I didn't remember. So failure is extremely valuable.
Yeah.
But I actually got a different impression. I was expecting a different answer from you about the pieces of tape, because Sennett talks about uh, little children getting these pieces of tape on their, I thought they were violins.
Could
And
have been
then,
violence. Yeah.
yeah, and then they have these little pieces that they put their fingers on the piece of tape and they go blunk, blunk, blunk. And you can, and he said you can hear a whole orchestra of these children plinking out something.
Yeah, he's talking about Suzuki Method.
The Suzuki Method, right?
Yeah.
And then there's this moment of confusion and chaos when they take off the pieces of tape, and now they have to learn how to play their instrument.
Right.
And what I thought he was saying was that those pieces of tape are a useful scaffolding to get you to a certain point, but then to get to the next point, you have to remove the scaffolding, and it feels like taking a step backward, although it's actually you're still making progress.
Yeah.
But do you think that the tape is just not a good idea in the first place?
Well, I guess I have to say, first of all, I feel like learning is a very, very individual and personal thing.
It might
And
be
I
different.
and I hate the idea of making, especially around things like this, or like in drawing, like making some big, pronouncement.
Yeah.
I can just say that for me, I discovered that the tape provided a false sense of security,
Mm-hmm.
and it also obscured what I later learned I was truly looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what I want to say is that it may not be a bad thing, but it does create, it may not be like a universally bad thing, but it can create a certain level of obscurity that that one then later has to deal with.
Yeah.
That could be fine. But Sennett's point is, in his view, it's not fine,
Mm-hmm.
and that working without the tape is a better way of working.
Mm.
And I agree. And
Mm. Okay.
I agree with what he's saying, but I have to speak from, so to clear up what might seem contradictory.
Yeah.
I agree with what he's saying, but I also have my own experience, which led me circuitously to understand his perspective. I would have said, 6 months into it, I would have said, "Oh no, the tapes are important."
Yeah.
9 months into it, I said,
Right.
"Tapes are not important."
And I think that's the key here. It's not, is technology good? Is it bad? The question is, when should you use it, and how should you use it, and for what purpose?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, what's the equivalent
Yeah.
of those little pieces of tape in language learning? And the answer immediately, it's Google Translate. Google Translate is the equivalent of those little pieces of tape for language learners. I have, my students, I asked them in our first class, what do you need English for? And 90% of them say, I need it for my job. I work in an international company. I need to send and receive emails and talk to people. And I say, well, how do you do it now? And they say, with Google Translate. And Google Translate takes you somewhere. And then the question is, how many people are trapped in Google Translate? And they say, this is good enough, and I don't need anything better. And in that case, they're just waiting until the next crisis that proves to them that they do need something better,
Yeah.
Um, And should I be, with my students, should I be a strict taskmaster and say, now you're in my class, never, ever, ever use Google Translate. Always, I don't know, pray to the gods of English and they will give you the words that you need. Of course, I have to. That's not going to help, right? Of course, I have to say, yes, you should continue to use Google Translate, but the goal of my class is that you will come to rely on it less and less. And you'll find that studying the vocabulary and remembering it and habitualizing it to the point where the word just pops into your head when you need it, that's better. That's another level of I don't even know. It's comparing the ocean to a picture of the ocean.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I view it kind of as familiarity, and words or expressions or ideas in another language become really usable when we become really familiar with them. And as we've discussed before, when you're an older language learner, memorization is not the equivalent of familiarity.
Yeah.
So there's this living, breathing thing that happens that makes language familiar, and but memorization works for some people too. I just think that it's interesting that we come to this point in this conversation about the Craftsman, because I think that one of the other things that might be happening in this book, and I feel certain was happening in this book, is that this is the equivalent of setting the table. And he's actually preparing us for another conversation.
Right, because he has 2 more books, doesn't he?
Right. And this conversation is about community. And we might have referred to it earlier as communities of interest. So we can say that ceramicists constitute a community of interest, and so on and so forth. But I would extend that a little bit further and say that I had a conversation this past week with a ceramicist, Yukinari Yamamura, and I'm preparing to do a photo shoot in which I need to move from marked surfaces, that is, surfaces that have drawings on them or markings on them, to surfaces that are abrased and purely white. Pardon me. And I tried this with plaster, and I was not happy with the results I got. Not only that, but I wanted these surfaces to be curved, and thin layers of plaster do not, they crack.
Yeah.
So that doesn't work. So so my idea was to use porcelain, and there's a material called slip porcelain, which would allow me to paint the porcelain onto paper, for instance, or some other material that is bent already, and then I can mark it, and then I can sand it. So we had this, actually it was quite a remarkable conversation, and I just want to take a moment to sort of set the stage about that conversation. Okay. We had planned to have this conversation at a cafe in Umeda Station. And because of the state of emergency, many cafes are closing early, 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
And we were due to meet at 7, and we discovered that our cafe was closed. So we went to a convenience store and got some coffees and went and sat outside in a large plaza that's outside of a building called Grand Front and the Umeda Station. It's quite a spectacular situation. And the backdrop to this plaza is a building called the Sky Building, which was designed and has entirely reflective surfaces. So in the conceptual drawings that the architect did for the Sky Building, he has sheets of writing with clouds in them and all kinds of things and moments where the continuity of the writing breaks up because it's writing across a very intense reflection from the building. So in other words, he has a drawing of the building that represents both shadows and highlights. And as he's writing across the page and he writes across the building, those areas where there is shadow, his writing is very clear. And in those areas where there is highlight, his writing is extremely faint. He lightens.
Did he do that intentionally?
Huh?
Yeah.
Yes, he does intentionally.
Oh, okay.
This is the drawing.
Wow, that's a very artistic technique to use for architectural drawings.
Well, many architects do that.
Oh, okay.
They use these kinds of. I mean, when I worked in architecture years ago, my job was to make not what we call presentation drawings and models, and these were conceptual renderings as much as they were technical drawings.
Okay. To give some evocation as well as just the shape of the building.
So this is what it feels like.
Yeah.
Standing near the building. But what this architect was doing was exploring what the concept was like of a building whose surfaces would be so highly reflective as to be so variable throughout the day. My point is that we were talking about creating a surface that wasn't reflective, but we were talking about creating a surface which would withstand both marking and unmarking. And we were having this conversation in front of a building, which essentially does that same thing.
Yeah.
And we were having this conversation in the midst of maybe 1,000 people who were all distributed at socially
2 meter intervals, right?
across this entire huge plaza.
Yeah.
And so we were engaging in a kind of, we were bringing this conversation of craft to this intensely social situation.
Yeah.
And people quite deliberately gather there because it's extraordinarily beautiful location in the middle of the city, and because it represents a very high level of craft in terms of building. So that level of craftsmanship becomes an invitation to a certain kind of sociality.